Close your eyes, if you like, or simply let them rest. Tonight, there is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do. This is just a quiet story about ordinary people, ordinary days, and a world that existed long before any of us were here to wonder about it. We are going back 1,000 years tonight, not to kings or wars, but to something smaller and truer than that, to a child waking up on a cold morning in a world made of wood smoke and wool and the slow turning of seasons. Come quietly. There is no rush. Tonight, we travel quietly back in time. Not to a battlefield, not to a throne room, and not to any great turning point that changed the course of nations. We travel instead to something much smaller, and perhaps much closer to the heart, to the ordinary life of a child. A child waking up on a cold morning, somewhere in the rolling countryside of medieval Europe, around the year 1000. A child who had no word for the world we live in now, who knew nothing beyond the hills at the edge of the valley, and who fell asleep each night to the sound of wind moving through thatch and the low, steady breathing of animals sheltering just on the other side of a thin wooden partition. We know so little about these children. Their names have mostly been lost. Their voices faded into silence long before anyone thought to write them down. But their lives left traces in the soil, in church records, in the objects found carefully buried beside them, in the wear patterns of ancient tools small enough to have fit in a child's hand. History tends to remember the powerful, but tonight we are going to remember someone else entirely. So let us go there gently. Let us settle into the idea of a life lived 1,000 years before our own, and let ourselves wonder, quietly and without rush, what a morning felt like, what supper tasted like, what it meant to be young and small and alive in a world that was so very different from ours, and yet, in the ways that matter most, perhaps not so different at all. Around the year 1000, the world that most children were born into looked almost nothing like the world we know today. There were no cities in the way we understand them now. There were towns, yes, some of them ancient, built on the bones of Roman settlements. But for the overwhelming majority of people alive at that time, life happened in villages, small ones, a cluster of timber houses, a church, a mill beside a stream, fields spreading outward in long strips toward the tree line. That was the world. That was all of it. The great forests of Europe were still vast and largely untamed in this period. They pressed in close to the edges of settlements, full of wolves and wild boar, and the kind of deep, unbroken darkness that we in our lit world can barely imagine. A child growing up in rural England, or in the farming villages of northern France, or along the quieter stretches of the Rhine Valley, would have grown up with that forest always present on the horizon. Familiar, yes, but also a boundary. A reminder that the human world was still something carved carefully out of a much larger wildness. The year 1000 is often spoken of as a moment of quiet anxiety in medieval Europe, the turning of the millennium, whispers of change, people wondering what the years ahead held. But for ordinary people, for farmers and their children and their grandparents, the year passed much like any other. The harvest still needed bringing in, the animals still needed feeding, the fire still needed tending. Life in this period was governed almost entirely by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the land. There were no clocks in the modern sense. Time was marked by church bells, by the movement of light across a field, by the depth of the cold in the air. A child born into this world learned very early to read the sky, to understand what a certain kind of cloud meant for the week ahead, to feel in their body the slow turning of the year. This was the world they opened their eyes to each morning. Quiet, physical, unhurried in some ways, and demanding in almost every other. Imagine waking before dawn. The room is dark, not the comfortable dimness of a curtained bedroom, but a genuine thick dark, the kind that presses softly against your eyes. The air is cold. Your breath makes small clouds above you. Somewhere close, just on the other side of a low partition, you can hear the shuffling warmth of the family's animals. Perhaps a goat, perhaps a few chickens, maybe a cow if the family was fortunate enough to have one. Their body heat was not an accident. They were kept close deliberately, because in the deep of winter, every source of warmth mattered. You would have slept on something close to the ground. Perhaps a straw pallet, perhaps a low wooden frame stuffed with dried grass or wool. If you were lucky, you had a rough woolen blanket. If the family was poor, you slept pressed together with siblings, sharing warmth the way animals do, out of necessity and without any particular thought about it. The house itself was small. For most rural children in this period, home was a single room, or perhaps two if the family had any standing in the village. The walls were timber, or sometimes wattle and daub, thin branches woven together and plastered with a mixture of clay and straw. The roof was thatch. There was a hearth in the center of the room, a simple fire that burned most of the day and night, its smoke drifting upward through a hole in the roof, or finding its way out through gaps in the walls. There was no chimney in most homes of this period. The smoke went where it wished, and the inside of every home was permanently faintly hazy, the beams above darkened to black over years of daily fires. The floor was earth, packed hard and sometimes covered with rushes, dried reeds laid down to give some softness underfoot and changed when they became too dirty or damp. In summer, herbs might be strewn among the rushes, not for beauty exactly, but because they helped with the smell, and because certain plants kept away insects. Morning began with the fire. It had to be coaxed back to life from its overnight embers, a task the adults usually managed, but one the children helped with as soon as they were old enough to carry wood without dropping it. Everything in a medieval household depended on the fire. It cooked the food, it warmed the room. It kept the darkness back in the early hours before the light came through the gaps in the shuttered windows. And then there was the food. Breakfast, if there was one, was simple. A piece of dark bread, dense and chewy, made from rye or barley rather than the lighter wheat flour we associate with bread today. Perhaps a little something left from the previous evening. A bit of boiled grain, a cup of weak ale. Yes, ale. Even children drank it, though it was thin and low in alcohol by modern standards. Water drawn from an unprotected source could carry illness. The weak ale was, in many ways, the safer choice, and everyone drank it as a matter of course, without it seeming unusual in any way. The great staple of the medieval peasant diet was something called pottage. It sounds humble, and it was a thick, slow-cooked stew made from whatever was available: dried peas, lentils, onions, leeks, turnips, cabbages, sometimes a bit of salted pork if the autumn slaughter had been recent. Sometimes nothing but grain and water, and whatever herbs grew near the door. It was filling, and it was warm, and for many families, it was what sat in the pot above the fire for most of the day, thickening and deepening in flavor as the hours passed. Meat was a rarity for most children. The animals that lived alongside the family were too valuable to eat casually. They provided milk or wool or labor. A chicken might be kept for her eggs, not for the table. When an animal was slaughtered, usually in autumn when the cost of keeping it through winter became too great, every part of it was used. Nothing was wasted. Children learned this instinctively, that food was something you were careful with, something you did not take for granted. Outside, the village moved in its own slow rhythm. After the morning's first tasks were done, the animals watered, the fire stoked, a simple meal eaten. There was work. There was always work. The fields needed tending. Water needed hauling from the well. Wood needed splitting and stacking. For children, duties began early, not out of cruelty, but simply because labor was the language of survival, and everyone in the household spoke it. Younger children might mind the even younger ones, or watch over a few geese to keep them from wandering into the crops. Older children worked alongside adults in the fields, learning through proximity and repetition the rhythms of sowing and harvest, the signs that told you when the ground was ready, when the rye was tall enough to cut. A child in a medieval village was, in many ways, a small adult in training, watching, practicing, absorbing the knowledge they would need to sustain their own family one day. And yet, there was still something recognizably childlike about their days. In the spaces between work, the warm middle of a summer afternoon, the slow hours of an early evening, children played. They ran. They made things. They called across the commons to one another in the way children always have. The village was their whole world, and they knew every corner of it, with the intimate familiarity that comes from having grown up with your feet in its soil. Clothing was rough and simple. Wool was the primary fabric. Woven at home, spun from the fleece of local sheep. The colors were muted, browns, grays, the deep natural cream of undyed wool, a tunic reaching to the knee, belted at the waist, foot wrappings in winter, bare feet in summer. Shoes for children were uncommon unless the family had real resources, and even then, they were simple things. Soft leather, tied at the ankle. The cold was the constant companion of winter life. You felt it always. It was in the floor beneath your feet, and the air at the end of your nose, and the deep ache in your fingers when you had been outside too long. Medieval homes were never truly warm in January. The fire helped. The animals helped. Each other helped. But the cold was simply part of what winter was. Something to be endured with patience and the quiet knowledge that the light would eventually return. Life for a child 1,000 years ago carried uncertainties that we, in our own time, are largely fortunate enough to have moved beyond. The most profound of these was simply the fragility of early life. Many children did not survive their first years. Medieval burial records, sparse as they are, and the quiet evidence of archaeological sites speak gently to this reality. Parents in this period understood, in a way that most of us do not have to, that the children in their care were not guaranteed to stay. And in response to that understanding, communities wove deep bonds of care around the very young, drawing them into a wider network of support that extended far beyond the immediate family. Illness came unpredictably and often could not be turned away. A fever in winter could take hold quickly. A wound that became infected was a serious matter. The remedies available, herbal preparations, poultices, the comfort of prayer, were offered with genuine tenderness and belief, even when they could not cure. A sick child was watched over carefully, kept near the fire, attended to through the night by whoever was needed. The physical demands of agricultural life also shaped young bodies from an early age, carrying, walking long distances, working in cold and wet conditions. Children built a kind of quiet endurance through this, a familiarity with physical effort that became simply part of who they were. And hunger was a reality that visited most families at some point in the year. The period between the last of the winter stores and the first harvests of spring, sometimes called the hungry gap, was the most difficult stretch. Stored food ran low. Families ate carefully, stretching what remained, watching the fields for the first signs of green. Children felt this thinning of the table. They understood in their bodies what it meant to wait for the season to turn. But alongside all of this, and this is perhaps what is most important to hold on to, there was warmth. Genuine human warmth. The closeness of family life in a small home, bodies near each other through the night, voices known by heart from the earliest days, the village as a community where everyone's name was known, where a child running to a neighbor's door would be let in without question, the particular comfort of being small in a world where the same faces greeted you every single day. Hardship and belonging lived very close together. They usually do. Here is something that might settle gently in the mind. Children in the medieval world played with toys. Archaeologists have found them. Small, careful, simple things. Wooden horses and carved figures, balls made from leather scraps, clay marbles, little carts with wheels that actually turned. In some medieval urban sites, excavations have uncovered miniature cooking pots, tiny, functional-looking things that small hands clearly used to imitate the world of adults. Cloth dolls, too, their faces long since gone, but their existence confirmed in careful digs and old household records. And the games they played were not so far from what children play today. There were chasing games and hiding games. There were rough and tumble contests in the open air. In winter, when snow lay thick on the ground, children sledged. We know this because a handful of illustrations from the period show them doing exactly that, wrapped in their wool, launching themselves down hillsides on improvised sleds, faces bright with the particular pleasure of moving fast through cold air. There was also music woven through everything. Medieval villages were not silent places. There were fiddles and pipes, hand drums and bells. Saints' days were celebrated with dancing and singing, moments when the ordinary pressure of the working week lifted and the whole community became something louder and more joyful. Children grew up surrounded by this music, not recorded, not performed at a distance, but present and alive in the same air they breathed. One detail that often surprises people is the deep importance of the godparent in medieval childhood. When a baby was baptized, usually within days of birth, they were given godparents, adults outside the immediate family, who took on a formal spiritual responsibility for the child. But this relationship carried real practical weight as well. Godparents were among the first called upon if a parent became seriously ill or died. A child might have 2 or 3 godparents, each one an additional anchor in the community, an additional name they could turn toward. And there is this, too. Medieval children often did not mark their birthdays in the way we do now. What held more meaning in the Christian world that most of these children inhabited was the feast day of the saint whose name they carried. A child named Thomas would have the feast of St. Thomas noted in the year's calendar, and this was understood as something like their own special day. The saint was almost a companion, a figure whose name you shared, whose story you knew from church, who in some quiet spiritual sense watched over you from a great and peaceful distance. These small details, the carved toys, the saint's day, the godparents, the winter sledging, build a picture that feels less like an alien world and more like a different arrangement of deeply familiar things. There is a particular quality to the light in late afternoon in autumn. In a medieval village, as the sun moved toward the horizon and the air took on that first real edge of cold, life slowed. The animals were brought in or settled for the night. The fire was built up higher. The family gathered close to it, not necessarily talking much, just being near one another, near the warmth and the light, which was the only real light there was. Candles existed, but for most ordinary families, they were used sparingly. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were dim and smoky, and not burned without reason. When daylight ended, Life moved into a quieter register. Mending, spinning, simple tasks done by firelight. And then, early by our standards, sleep came. A child in that firelit room, watching the shadows move across the low ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling and the night outside, was living inside a kind of intimacy with the world that is very difficult to find now. There was no noise bleeding in from elsewhere, no light from a distant street, only the fire and the breath of the people nearby, and the occasional soft sound from the animals, and the wide, quiet darkness pressing gently against the walls. What did they think about, those children, in those last minutes before sleep? Perhaps the same things children always think about. The day replaying itself, a friend's face, the feeling of having run hard across a field in the afternoon, something that had made them laugh or puzzled them. The way a parent's voice sounded when they were calm, the smell of bread. We tend to think of the past as something very separate from us, and in practical terms, so much of it was. The cold floors and the wood smoke and the physical labor and the fragility of life. These are not things we carry now, but underneath all of it, in the part of human experience that hasn't changed in 1,000 years or 10,000, there is something we recognize. A child is a child, curious about the world, comforted by familiar voices, tired at the end of a long day, glad of warmth, looking forward to tomorrow in the uncomplicated way that children do, without quite knowing why, but feeling it anyway. Across 1,000 years, that thread runs quietly and unbroken, and there is something in that, something steady and soft, that feels worth sitting with for a moment. The idea that in a small house on a cold night, with the fire settling to embers and the frost forming on the ground outside, a child turned over on their straw pallet and closed their eyes, and their last thought before sleep was perhaps nothing more complicated than the knowledge that they were warm and the people they loved were near. That was enough. It was always enough. The night deepens over the village. The fire in the center of the room has settled to a bed of glowing embers, deep red and orange, throwing a low and gentle light across the sleeping shapes of the family. The animals shift occasionally on the other side of the partition. A soft sound in the darkness, familiar and reassuring. Outside, the sky is very clear and very cold, and the stars are extraordinary, thick with light in a way that, in our lit world, we almost never see anymore. The child sleeps. Tomorrow there will be work again, and cold air on the face, and bread and pottage, and the familiar voices of the village. There will be a friend to find across the common ground. There will be the sound of the church bell marking midday, and the smell of turned earth if the season is right, and the small, particular pleasure of coming back inside from the cold to find the fire still going. A whole life lived close to the ground, close to the seasons, close to the people who mattered. We will never fully know what it felt like to be young in that time and that world. The distance is too great, and the records too few, but we can hold the idea of it gently, without forcing it into certainty, and let it rest in the mind like a quiet image seen through faintly frosted glass. A child, a fire, a winter night, stars above the thatch, the sound of slow breathing. Some things needed no words then, and perhaps tonight they need none now either. Rest well. And there we leave them, a village in the dark, a fire breathing itself slowly out, a child asleep, somewhere in the long, unremembered past. History is full of these quiet lives, people who left no great monuments, no famous names, only the simple trace of having been here, of having loved the people around them, of having found warmth where they could. If this story brought you some peace tonight, then that is all it ever needed to do. Sleep well. The world can wait until morning.